You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Año nuevo, los mismos Extra Value Meals en McDonald's. Ahora te puedes llevar 2 snack wraps y papitas y una bebida mediana por solo $8. Solo por tiempo limitado. Precios y participación pueden variar. Los precios pueden ser más altos en Hawái, Alaska y California y con entrega.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 516 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys know, during May and June 1864, in the war's Eastern Theater, the Federals' Army of the Potomac and the Confederates' Army of Northern Virginia had squared off against each other in the Overland Campaign, and the result was unprecedented carnage. Throughout the month of May, the two armies had lost well over 50,000 men, which was nearly the entire strength of the Confederate Army of Tennessee in Georgia.
And the fighting at Cold Harbor in early June only continued that pattern of bloodshed. On June 3rd alone, more than 3,500 Federals were lost in less than 1 hour during a massive assault against Confederate lines. Those losses were heavy, but the Yankees were inching closer and closer to Richmond, while Robert E. Lee did everything in his power to stop them.
Such horrific losses shocked the nation and have captivated the attention of historians ever since, who have viewed it as the primary action in the summer of 1864. But at the same time, many miles to the south, William Tecumseh Sherman and Joseph Johnston were engaged in an entirely different type of struggle in a campaign that was just as important. However, Sherman's insistence on maneuver and flanking meant that he had thus far generally avoided the massive bloodletting that was taking place in Virginia.
Having started his campaign against Johnston at the same time Grant began moving in Virginia, Sherman, if he wished, could rightly claim that at the start of June 1864, his effort had been the greater success thus far.
He'd pushed nearly 70 miles into northern Georgia, using miles and miles of railroads there and in Tennessee and in northern Alabama to keep his troops supplied. By early June, Sherman was creeping ever closer to Atlanta, whose capture would be a tremendous prize for the Federals.
With his twin goals of engaging Johnston's army and damaging Confederate military resources, Sherman was achieving both. So long as Sherman kept up the pressure on Johnston, the rebel commander was prevented from sending any possible reinforcements to Robert E. Lee in Virginia.
And because Atlanta was one of the most important rail hubs in the South, its capture by Federal forces would be a tremendous blow to Confederate transportation and infrastructure.
Up in Richmond, the powers that be were becoming increasingly frustrated with Joe Johnston and the state of affairs in Georgia. On June 4th, Confederate President Jefferson Davis's chief military advisor warned him, quote, "The condition of affairs in Georgia is daily becoming more serious."
On June 7th, Bragg forwarded that note to Johnston, saying he'd written it so as to, quote, "place before the president the real condition of affairs with you." Well, Bragg's note no doubt reminded Joe Johnston that he needed to achieve a victory, and the sooner he could produce one, the better. In Virginia, with Grant threatening Richmond, and in Georgia, with Sherman threatening Atlanta, something had to be done, and soon.
During the first week of June, after their foray away from the railroad and out into the North Georgia countryside, the Yankees reconnected with the Western and Atlantic and went into camps around the small town of Ackworth.
In a June 9th letter to his wife, Sherman referred to the fighting in the Dallas New Hope Church, Pickett's Mill area as a quote-unquote perfect success. And to his credit, Sherman had forced Johnston to give up Allatoona Pass, but Johnston had been able to block Sherman's flanking movement and had inflicted several thousand casualties on the Federals.
Sherman may have claimed to his wife that his foray away from the railroad had been a perfect success, but his next move would not be another wide-turning maneuver like he had just tried.
Instead, he'd stay connected to the Western and Atlantic and use the railroad and road networks in the Marietta area to move toward the Chattahoochee River. On June 2nd, Sherman informed Henry Halleck in Washington of this strategy, reporting, quote, "I have ordered the railroad to be repaired and will gradually move across by left of the railroad. The country is most difficult, being of dense undergrowth and short, steep ridges of flinty stone. Thus far we have had no real battle, but one universal skirmish extending over a vast region."
Sherman wasn't telling the entire truth by stating there hadn't been any real battles, when in fact there'd been several. But the purpose of Sherman's report to Halleck was mostly to communicate the difficulties his force had encountered thus far, including the terrain and the daily grind of the campaign.
At the same time that Sherman was preparing for another push, across the lines, Joe Johnston was readying the rebel army for another defensive stand. After the Federals reconnected with the railroad and concentrated around Ackworth, Johnston pulled the Army of Tennessee back to the mountainous terrain west of Marietta. These mountains aren't mountains like we have here in Colorado, but rather, as we talked about last time, they're a series of high, scattered hills that protruded above the Georgia trees. Nevertheless, these elevations and ridges provided yet another strong defensive position for the Confederates. So strong, in fact, that both armies would spend all of June in a tense daily conflict among them.
Over the next several weeks, the Atlanta campaign took a dramatic turn from the events in May. Whereas the first 4 weeks of the campaign saw both armies move from the vicinity of Chattanooga to less than 40 miles from Atlanta, the month of June would now see the events of the campaign slow to what appeared to be a grinding halt.
For the soldiers of both sides, June would bring continuous skirmishing, picket fights, entrenchments, and the daily presence of the enemy. This skirmishing was a window into the constant grind of Civil War combat in 1864. As W.H. Chamberlain, a veteran of the 81st Ohio, noted years after the war, quote, "In the Western Army, the skirmish line was undoubtedly seen at its best during the Atlanta campaign. Nowhere during the war were the elements of a true soldier more fully developed than in the exercise of skill, endurance, ingenuity, and audacity by those who were the eyes and ears of the army. It was a place in which a man literally offered himself to death. Almost every skirmisher was a target, and he was under constant apprehension of a sudden attack or a sharpshooter's bullet."
Wilbur Hinman, a veteran of the Army of the Cumberland, recalled the brutal pace of the campaign that summer as, quote, "incessant and deadly." Hinman said, quote, "Upon taking up a new position, nothing else was thought until the front was covered with a line of works, built of logs, fence rails, stones, anything that came to hand."
Hinman told of an instance when a 4th Corps brigade advanced to take a ridge line. Before setting out, the Union soldiers gathered pieces of wood and timber to carry with them so that upon reaching their new position, new fortifications could be started within minutes. So the men worked equally hard at protecting themselves as they did killing the enemy. As Sergeant Nixon Stewart later wrote, "We considered the pickaxe and shovel as weapons of war."
The daily strain of this combat on the men in the ranks meant that all were aware of the ever-present danger of death. On June 9th, George Hodges of the 41st Ohio described the mental and physical effects that the campaign was having on him. Quote, "If anyone should ask me how old I was today, I would tell them I was about 100 years old. I think I feel that old, at any rate. I have grown poor very fast since this campaign commenced. I have had to be up a great deal nights watching the enemy, and in the daytime the sun shines so hot that a person cannot sleep. I guess I have complained enough and will change the subject."
Joe Johnston positioning the Army of Tennessee in the mountains and rugged terrain west of Marietta meant a continuance of the fighting, digging, marching, and dying that had made up the Atlanta campaign thus far. On June 10th, the Federal armies began moving forward. Leaving Ackworth, Sherman intended to advance along the Sandtown Road, which kept his force close enough to the railroad to maintain his supply connection, while also still applying pressure on the rebels' main lines.
Along the Sandtown Road lay Pine Mountain and Lost Mountain, as well as the ridges around Kennesaw Mountain in the town of Marietta. By June 12th, George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland was positioned near Pine Mountain, pressuring the center of the Confederate line.
2 days later, Joe Johnston rode to the summit of Pine Mountain, accompanied by William Hardee and Leonidas Polk. From their vantage point, the three Confederate generals surveyed their own lines and those of the enemy. William Tecumseh Sherman was also out and about, and when he saw a gaggle of rebels atop Pine Mountain, he ordered a nearby artillery battery to fire and disperse the group. Soon, several shells were in the air, hurtling toward the summit of Pine Mountain. While Johnston and Hardee quickly took cover, Polk lingered just a moment too long. One of the shells struck him directly in the left side near the shoulder and tore through his body. He was killed instantly.
As news of Polk's death spread, a profound grief began to set in among the men of the Army of Tennessee. While many historians have criticized Polk's generalship, he was beloved by many of the soldiers who served under him. Upon learning of Polk's death, Chaplain Charles Quintard wrote, "I was never more shocked and overwhelmed."
Polk's death was a tremendous blow to the Army of Tennessee, but there was hardly time to mourn the loss of so beloved a commander. Since Pine Mountain formed a vulnerable salient in the Confederate line, Johnston issued orders that it be abandoned, while Major General William Wing Loring assumed command of Polk's corps.
Loring had a long Civil War career by that point. In the early days of the war, he led Confederates in Western Virginia against Federals commanded by George McClellan. After that, he'd served under Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley in 1862, and then under Joe Johnston during the Vicksburg campaign the following year. Taking over Polk's corps was by far Loring's greatest role during the war, and it came at a crucial moment during the Atlanta campaign.
The next several days following Polk's death saw a series of small yet strategic Confederate retreats, forced largely by a series of equally small advances made by the Federals. While these movements only covered short distances, they did lead to several fierce clashes, as Sherman, realizing that the rebels had abandoned Pine Mountain, ordered each of his commanders to put pressure on the enemy lines.
On June 15th, Yankees of 15th Corps clashed with Confederates along Noonday Creek on the far left of the Federal line. Despite getting the better of the rebels, the Yankees fell back since they had been ordered to just threaten the Confederate right.
Meanwhile, to the south, Thomas and Schofield ran into stiff resistance. Union soldiers from 20th Corps hit Confederates from Patrick Cleburne's division near Gilgal Church. The fighting there was so intense that Lieutenant Charles Cox of the 70th Indiana recalled that, quote, "Never was a body of men in such a hot place as was the 70th on that terrible day," end quote. And by the way, Cox's regiment, the 70th Indiana, was commanded by Colonel Benjamin Harrison, the future 23rd President of the United States.
Fights such as those were what ultimately led Johnston to issue orders for the Confederates to fall back into their final Kennesaw line, and on June 19th, the Army of Tennessee took up position on Kennesaw Mountain, Little Kennesaw, and the surrounding ridges and hills.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
Kan du norsk?
If you used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world, with lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers. Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Spotify, spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi there, it's Leo Laporte. Every week on our Tech News Roundtable, This Week in Tech, I bring together some of the smartest journalists and tech experts to make sense of the stories that actually matter to you. We cut through the noise, have real conversations, and give you a clear look at the trends shaping the future. It's smart, it's fun, it's a show I love doing the most. You can download and subscribe at twit.tv/twit.
Johnston's engineers had been preparing the new Kennesaw line for 2 days. As the sun rose on June 19th, the rebels were settling in to what historian Richard McMurray called the best defensive ground the Army of Tennessee held since the opening of the campaign at Rocky Face Ridge.
The initial Confederate positions on the Kennesaw line were situated with Polk's Corps, now led by Loring, stretched across Big and Little Kennesaw. To the right was Hood's Corps, guarding the ground north of the mountains as well as the railroad.
To the south, holding the left of the rebel line, was Hardee's Corps. Many Confederate soldiers, such as Private Alexander Porter of the 22nd Mississippi, were impressed by their new surroundings. He wrote in his diary, "The lines of both armies can be seen plainly from the mountain. The view is magnificent beyond describing."
Major General Samuel French, whose division occupied Big and Little Kennesaw, shared the same magnificent view as Porter. When the weather was clear, the Georgia countryside could be seen for miles and miles. As French noted, quote, "Kennesaw Mountain is about 4 miles northwest of Marietta. It is over 2.5 miles in length and rises abruptly from the plain, solitary and alone, to the heights of perhaps 700 feet.
French continues, quote, "Little Kennesaw, being bald and destitute of timber, affords a commanding view of all the surrounding country as far as the eye can reach, except where the view is hidden by the higher peak. The view from this elevation embraces Lost Mountain, Pine Mountain, and all the beautiful cultivated plain, dotted here and there with farmhouses."
French's description is fitting. The main peak of Big Kennesaw rises nearly 700 feet above the Georgia countryside. Immediately to the south, separated only by a small saddle, is Little Kennesaw, which rises roughly 400 feet above the surrounding fields.
South of Little Kennesaw, and rising to half its height, is Pigeon Hill. The prominence of Big Kennesaw and the other nearby heights is noticeable for miles around, and for both armies in 1864, it was a key position. Whoever held the mountain could control the Western and Atlantic Railroad and the town of Marietta, which lay a few miles east of the mountain. Just beyond Marietta lay the Chattahoochee River, and beyond the Chattahoochee River was Atlanta. Kennesaw Mountain was therefore the last strong defensive position that Johnston could hold before reaching the Chattahoochee, which itself was the final natural barrier in front of Atlanta.
As the opposing armies settled in around Kennesaw Mountain, soldiers from both sides expressed either their satisfaction or frustration with what appeared to be another grueling stage of the campaign.
Bill Raff of the 19th Ohio vented his feelings in a letter to his parents on June 20th. Quote, "I wish that we could get the enemy out of this mountainous country. Every time they fall back, they have well-fortified positions to get behind."
Sergeant John Hagan of the 29th Georgia noted on June 22nd, quote, "I believe the bloodiest battle of the war will come off in a short time, and I feel confident that when the Yankees pitch into us, we will give them a whipping."
Lieutenant Colonel Columbus Sykes of the 43rd Mississippi wrote, "I think Sherman's flanking process has nearly played out, and he must soon come down to his work by making a direct attack on our front. For this purpose, he may some day suddenly mass his troops on some given point and attempt by brute force to break through our lines. I think, however, he will find us ready for him at all points of the line. The enemy's on to Atlanta movement has become very slow as well as dangerous."
The new position at Kennesaw Mountain afforded the Confederates a prime artillery location, the likes of which few armies had the luxury to hold during the course of the Civil War. All the Union soldiers, including Corporal Charles Smith of the 16th Wisconsin, hated the threat of enemy artillery on the mountain, noting that, quote, "the top is lined with rebel batteries that hurl their missiles with deadly intent."
In his history of his regiment, the 113th Ohio, Francis McAdams recalled the sight of Confederate artillery on the mountain preparing to wreak havoc on the Federals below. Quote, "We can see the gunner as he rams the charge home. Then comes a puff of smoke, and in 2 or 3 seconds the shots come shrieking through the air, sometimes striking in the timber in our rear, sometimes plowing up the dirt in our front and bounding over our heads. About dinner time we were driven into our pits, leaving our dinners on the fire. We remained sheltered till our dinners were overcooked. The boys were so mad at this that they omitted to return thanks at their meals."
With the constant threat of Confederate artillery shells raining down on them from Kennesaw Mountain, many Union soldiers would have shared the opinion of Lieutenant George Hurlbut, who wrote to his wife on June 23rd, quote, "At times it is very unsafe for a person to leave the earthworks."
While the Federals suffered down below, the Confederates on the mountain itself had no easy time either, as Union artillerists did their best in trying to respond to the rebel fire. Lieutenant John Kendall from the 4th Louisiana painted a terrifying picture of the circumstances for those Confederates who experienced the brunt of the Federal counter-battery fire. Quote, "The summit of the mountain was the focal point of countless missiles. Shrieking, howling, hissing, gobbling, or sharply cracking, the shells were like a swarm of unseen fiends, while the smoke of their explosions, the villainous smelt they let loose, and the heavy curtain-like vapor made a hot and sulphurous atmosphere, highly suggestive of the place where His Satanic Majesty is reputed to reside."
Artillery played a major role in the fighting around Kennesaw Mountain. The Confederates took advantage of their elevated artillery platform to harass the Federal lines below, while Union gunners looked for every opportunity to strike back at their tormentors.
Nearly every letter and diary entry written by the soldiers around Kennesaw in June 1864 made note of the daily barrage of shot and shell flying through the air around the mountain. Something else that was noted by nearly every soldier was the terrible weather.
In Georgia, the month of June 1864 saw several weeks with rain falling from the sky nearly every day. The rain and the mud were tiresome and slowed down every march and movement. Daily life became a slog, a struggle to move through mud and stay dry, causing considerable difficulty for the soldiers on both sides.
William Crook of the 13th Tennessee described the situation in a letter to his family back home. Quote, "We have been having the most displeasable season of weather I have ever witnessed at this time of year. Raining almost incessantly day and night. The roads are almost impassable. We have been exposed to all this rain and mud. I have not slept in a house or tent in the last 45 days.
Alabaman William McMillian also noted that June had been a month of nearly nonstop rain, with roads becoming quagmires of mud. In a letter home, he echoes Crook's words, quote, "The weather has been very unfavorable for military operations recently. We have had rain every day but one or two since May 31st. The roads are almost impassable and it still continues to rain. It is bad on soldiers. We have not tents and no covering but the canopy of heaven."
Across the lines, Ohioan Albert Champlain observed in his diary that the rain was causing his comrades to, quote, "take the appearance partly of U.S. soldiers and partly of drowned rats. It rains all day."
The Army commanders couldn't help but note the problems that the rain was causing for their men. In a June 18th letter to Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman described the, quote, "immense quantity of rain," end quote, that had fallen, saying that on that day, quote, "it is raining as though it had no intention ever to stop."
A few days later, Joe Johnston mentioned the rain in one of his dispatches to Bragg in Richmond. Quote, "The continued heavy rain has made the roads almost impassable. Military operations off the roads are next to impossible."
Yet even in the midst of the booming artillery, the constant skirmish fire, and the tormenting rain and mud, Sherman and Johnston weren't content to sit idly by, and so the campaign continued despite these difficulties.
For Sherman, this meant attempting to dislodge the Confederates from their Kennesaw line. Federal forces were positioned with George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland in the center, McPherson's Army of the Tennessee on the left near Big Kennesaw, and Schofield's Army of the Ohio on the Union right to the south. Sherman realized that any attempt to move north of the mountain would jeopardize his supply lines and draw heavy fire from Confederate guns. Additionally, Confederate cavalry was guarding the enemy's flanks, so there was no question of attempting a surprise march around Kennesaw.
Sherman preferred moving south, which meant lengthening his lines and extending the Federal right. His dispatches during the first few days at Kennesaw clearly spell out his thoughts and his focus on the Confederate left south of the mountain.
On June 18th, Sherman informed George Thomas that as soon as the rain stopped, quote, "I propose we shall attack and drive in the enemy's left flank." This shows Sherman believed that the Confederates were strongest along the railroad and on Kennesaw Mountain itself, making the southern end of the line the best place to strike the enemy. He instructed Thomas that as soon as the extension of the Federal right had stretched the rebel left too thin, quote, "we must strike quick and with great energy."
Several days later, on June 21st, Sherman expressed his frustrations to Halleck in Washington, blaming the bad weather for the lack of any significant progress recently, and assuring him that, quote, "I am all ready to attack the moment weather and roads will permit troops and artillery to move with anything like life."
However, by the time Sherman sent that message, the situation around Kennesaw had already begun to change. On June 20th, troops in Oliver Otis Howard's 4th Corps moved to seize two hills near the Confederate center, located south of Pigeon Hill and just north of the Dallas Road. By the end of the day, the Federals had been only partially successful. At the cost of several hundred men killed and wounded, they initially took both hills, but most of the hill known as Bald Knob was soon retaken by the Confederates.
Howard recaptured the hill the following day, but the true value of what occurred at Bald Knob was that it helped divert Confederate attention from Schofield on the Federal right, who had been busy moving men farther south beyond the rebel left flank.
Worried the Yankees would make just such a move, Joe Johnston had decided to strengthen his left by shifting troops from his right. To that end, Johnston ordered John Bell Hood to switch positions, moving his corps from the Army's right flank to the far left on the southern end of the Kennesaw line.
Hood began to move on the night of June 21st and was in position by the following afternoon.
And Hood clearly had a sense of the importance of this task. As you guys will recall, earlier in the campaign, at Cassville, Hood was charged with being the key element in a Confederate attack that Johnston believed would wreck the Federal advance. However, Hood balked at the last moment, wisely calling off the assault when he received a report saying an unknown force of Yankees was on his flank. But now, here was Hood, playing a vital role in another operation. Now, Joe Johnston had made it clear Hood's assignment was defensive in nature, but as his men took up their new position on the Confederate left on June 22nd, John B. Hood was no doubt eager to make up for the missed opportunity at Cassville, and as a result, his aggressiveness on the 22nd would lead directly to a bloody fight at Kolb's Farm.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Decisions at Kennesaw Mountain, the 11 Critical Decisions That Define the Battle by Lawrence K. Peterson.
There are now a whole series of these Decisions at books, looking at Civil War battles, and this one obviously focuses on Kennesaw Mountain. They aren't meant to be narrative histories of campaigns or battles, but rather there are different chapters looking at the decisions that were made and what might have happened if different decisions were made. Well, the books are a good way to drill down into critical moments that took place during battles and campaigns, and it's a great series.
As always, you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like AJ and Cecil and Sean did this past week.
A big thank you to them, and also to Elaine for her donation this past week.
Well, you may have noticed we backtracked a bit with this episode and covered some of the same events we talked about last time. And that's because sometimes, during longer story arcs, we kind of feel the need for a reset. And here, we had the feeling that lately we were just rushing through a lot of what was happening here with the Atlanta campaign. And so we decided to hit the reset button and slow down a bit and take some more time telling the story we have here, and especially include more first-person accounts, which is always important to us. So, just in case you might have been wondering what was up and why we were talking about some of the same things again, well, there you go.
So, thanks for listening to this episode. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time when we talk about the fight at Kolb's Farm again. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.